Hello, welcome to Scary Thoughts, Horror, Philosophy, Culture. I'm Mark Cate.
And I'm Chad Lott.
This is episode 63. We're going to be talking about the movie The Crow from 1994. And to prepare you for our next episode, it's going to be our second Self-Help for Nihilists episode, and we will be discussing the Elizabeth Gilbert book Eat, Pray, Love.
A grimoire of your dreams.
It's so good. I'm very excited about that one. And I'm also excited to dig a little deeper into the Self-Help for Nihilists podcast.
Yep. I've been on the path of learning some new self-help methodologies, and they seem to be working. And they involve me not smoking weed, which is kind of weird.
Really?
Yeah, it's been a couple weeks.
What's that like for you?
I am insanely productive. Pretty much every metric in my life has improved. Not surprising, which is a little weird. And I've also, after 23andMe told me I had like a gluten intolerance marker, I gave that up. So those two things together, I'm almost intolerably energetic right now, which is pretty weird.
I see fire in your eyes.
Yes.
So you can email us at whatthe@scarythoughts.org about, whatever. Anything to plug?
Negative.
Same. Sign up for our newsletter. Go to scarythoughts.org. Give us your email address and name, and we'll give you love right back. And last little thing, spoilers ahead. Go watch The Crow. Maybe even read the comic book and come back to this podcast.
For sure, read the comic book. Maybe watch the movie.
Yes, that's true. But we're talking about the movie primarily here. Where do you want to start with this one?
Well, I want to start with that we were just on a lark doing this, and I think the reason why I picked it was like, in The Crow, there's Devil's Night. We have a Halloween episode coming up. This movie is not well tread by the horror community of the 1,000 horror podcasts out there now. I just didn't see it pop up that much, and I thought it would be kind of fun. And in my mind, I remembered this as 90s John Wick, but goth, and I rewatched it after about 20 years and was fairly disappointed in it. And you had never seen it, right?
No, I'd seen it.
Oh, you had seen it. Okay.
I'd seen it. The difference between our memories of what we thought of it at the time is correct me if I'm wrong, but my impression is that you saw it at a young age and its gothness left a great impression on you. Whereas with me, I was already in my 20s. And so for me, this iteration of goth was kind of poser shit. This was kind of Hollywood's fake goth, even though, Thrill Kill Cult is in it. It just felt sort of like selling out my culture, and I also wasn't goth anymore and didn't care about how Hollywood was going to play with it.
Yeah, my wife and I were talking about this, and she said, she surprised me by saying, one, that she loved this movie. And it's the first, comic book based nerd thing that I've ever heard her say that she liked. I mean, it was the first thing ever. She told me, she was like, oh yeah, I had a giant poster of it on my wall up into my 20s. Shocking to me. But she had not read the comic book. But I think through the Rocky Horror Picture Show, I knew people who were your age back then, and they had read and were really intimate with the comic book. Yeah. And were sort of old enough to be mistrustful of this movie, and they love the comic so much. It's like anything. You love the book, you think the movie's going to be trash before you ever see it.
Right.
I probably read the comic about 3 months before the movie came out. Like, the posters were up. It was being promoted, and I wanted to be able to say I had read the comic before I'd seen the movie. And
I still play that bullshit game.
Yeah. I mean, it's just the thing you do, man. And I was completely invested in the comic book. I mean, I was absolutely in love with it. I had been so into X-Men comics that it was really one of the first more underground comics that I had read, and was totally blown away by the difference in the artwork. And, I didn't really have anybody older in my life that guided me towards this shit. I just sort of stumbled into it. And the comic book was this key to this whole culture that I didn't really know a lot. I knew that I was very attracted to goth girls, and some of them would come to the Rocky Horror Picture Show, and I liked Nine Inch Nails because they were kind of from New Orleans, and that was a thing. The whole industrial goth thing was huge in New Orleans. But this comic is where I heard about Joy Division for the first time. It's where all these artists and writers like Arthur Rimbaud I'd never heard of until this comic book, and Baudelaire, and the references to Hieronymus Bosch, like all that stuff I didn't know anything about until I read the comic. And so I was completely invested in it.
Absolutely. Something, I mean, we'll talk more about its quality and all that later, I'm sure, but something I appreciate about this movie, even as an adult, is the way in which it plays into this history of movies, particularly in the 80s and 90s, that are sort of goth adjacent. So it's not necessarily straight up goth, but movies like The Hunger and The Lost Boys and Cat People and Angel Heart and Near Dark, and then later like Donnie Darko and Ginger Snaps and maybe the Craft, but that might be a little
The Craft
too,
for sure. I mean,
well,
I would
Craft
definitely
for sure,
count
but
the
it's also kind of a comedy.
For
It's
ladies,
it's definitely
it is
part,
huge.
It's absolutely part of it, but all of those movies I just mentioned, irony and humor are not really part of them. Like The Crow is totally lacking in any humor. Like a lot of these movies, whether they're amazing films or they're just sort of goofy afterthoughts in the dustbin of cinema history, they're all very self-serious.
This movie takes itself way too serious.
And that is something that is interesting about goth and about how do we look back on goth and what holds and what doesn't in cinema, in comic books, and in the music. Like, there's so much goth music, I find especially through the 90s when it became goth industrial, that is really embarrassing to go and listen back to because it is so earnest and its attempts to be darkly poetic are so forced. But what's odd is, so were Susie and the Banshees and Bauhaus and Joy Division, who were ostensibly post-punk bands and certainly not goth by any means.
Yeah.
Because that term really didn't mean what it means now until much later.
Yeah, I always used to make this distinction between like bands like Joy Division and bands that got signed to Cleopatra Records.
Totally.
Yeah, like you were trying to be goth versus just happened to be goth.
Right.
Yeah.
I also think it's interesting that sort of the origins of goth with Bauhaus, Joy Division, Susie and the Banshees, and then death rock with Christian Death, the earliest of all these bands they were all post-punk bands, basically. And then what mostly came in their wake were not post-punk bands. It was a lot of electronics, a lot of maintaining the baritone vocals, but over top grinding, often uninteresting, minimal music. And I think that the format for expression became very narrowcast, and it really doesn't age well.
No, it doesn't. But there's still like cool stuff around it a little bit, like Typo Negative, for example, which some people love, some people don't. I'm having a little bit of like a resurgent interest in October Rust right now for some reason.
Yeah.
I don't know why. Maybe it's just because it's October right now.
Right.
I've just been really going down this. After listening to the Crow soundtrack again, which is well loved and people really remember it being great, there are some trash songs on it. There's some really great stuff, like that Cure Burn song.
I think
it may be one of the top 10 Cure songs
Absolutely.
ever. The Joy Division cover that Nine Inch Nails does is phenomenal.
It's cool.
I Could Take or Leave, the Stone Temple Pilots song.
I have a soft spot for some of the grunge canon.
As much as I love Henry Rollins, I've never been a fan of Rollins' band, and that Ghost Rider song is not to my taste.
I agree.
Yeah.
But the Typo Negative thing is interesting too, because also the way goth sort of started splitting up through the late 80s is a lot of goth bands took the raw guitarness and went more hard rock and followed in the footsteps of like the Mission Fields of the Nephilim. And the most extreme example is the band that was Death Cult and then Southern Death Cult and then became the Cult. And then the Cult became, AC/DC, Aerosmith. Whereas bands like Typo Negative sort of perpetuated that sort of bombastic grinding in another direction.
Yeah. And then another weird little like overlapping or maybe like offshoot of this is like the New Orleans metal scene, which was very influenced by goth stuff. And, for a while, New Orleans metal bands were just butt rock hair bands like anybody else. And then the Melvins came through and everybody slowed down. And then, then you had the influence of slower metal bands like Typo Negative. So this goth element kind of came in. And you see it all over the iconography of like I Hate God, for example. That band, which I just missed. They were just at the DNA Lounge. I feel like a fucking asshole. Yeah, that was going on too down there. And it just made sense, man. But some stuff is hard to listen to, like Electric Hellfire Club, for example.
Yeah.
Terrible.
Oh.
Yeah.
But getting back to The Crow, it's how do I parse this out? So because the origins of goth music like the Chameleons and Christian Death are so close to my heart, I think my ability to get whether or not it's wincy, overbearing, and too earnest to take seriously at this point, or if it's, or how much it's, no, it is that raw thing. It is that amazing communication of darkness that I took it for maybe too seriously, but it still is that thing. Just the way like early punk, like some of it's painful and ridiculous and like just sounds like sad, angry children. And some of it holds up, 30, 40 years later as being this like urgent call to action.
Yeah, Minor Threat's first album still sounds as good as it did.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Right. I wonder the same thing with The Crow. So, you watch it when you're young and you're like, oh my God, this is me. I identify. And then years later, like, this is really kind of too much and it doesn't work.
Yeah. I don't know that I feel like that. I mean, part of it has to do with the source material, the comic book is so singular. It's so amazing. And the music that influences the comic book is the music that it still really holds up. I mean, that thing is Joy Division front to back. And
almost every Joy Division song title is in the comic book somewhere as an intertitle or a piece of dialogue or...
Yeah, and maybe we'll step into the comic book's history a little bit right here. James O'Barr, the creator of the comic book, he had been in the Marine Corps in the mid to late 70s, got out, started dating this woman who was pretty much the light of his life. And he is a dude, I would consider him a real deal outsider artist, grew up poor, was not supposed to be an artist of any type. All of his materials were very cheap because he was like borderline homeless most of the time. And he didn't have enough gas in his car or something like that to go see her. And so he called her and said, hey, will you come see me? And while walking to her car, she was killed by a drunk driver. And the way he describes it, and there's some really like painful interviews that he's given over the years that you can watch, and you realize how emotionally invested he was in her. He was basically like, look, what is this cruel joke? Like the only thing that was ever good in my life has been completely taken out. And that I think happened in like 1977 or 78. It's not totally clear, or at least it's not, I didn't find it, the actual date. And then he's listening to like Joy Division contemporaneously, really, like at the time. So like Ian Curtis kills himself while he's a fan of Joy Division. And the whole time he's drawing this book after he gets off work from his shitty mechanic bodywork job, he was a dude who just did nothing but work and come home and draw this comic. And, he describes it as he could only do it like 20 pages at a time, which is why it's paced as it is. And he would just obsessively listen to this music over and over again. And apparently Brandon Lee was a bit of a goth too. Like he was into bands like The Cult and things like that. And he would ride around in a hearse in LA and go to Hollywood Forever Cemetery and whatnot. So, from the very conception, this comic book is about music. I mean, the look of the character, it's Peter Murphy's face, Daniel Ash's hair, and Iggy Pop's body. And it's just all there. So music is definitely a part of it. But the music of the soundtrack is a different generation. And I think that might be where you're like, this is corny.
Yeah. I think there's also, some of it just is outright corny. And one thing that I wish wasn't in this movie is that it still has the failure that most cinema does of depicting rock music poorly.
Yeah.
It's got this amazing goth soundtrack, but then what Brandon Lee is supposed to be playing through his guitar on the rooftop is like blues rock Carlos Santana guitar center wank squealing, and it's trying too hard. It's the sound of a guitar trying to express emotion, man.
Yeah,
and it doesn't read. It's just wincing. Good. No, and it doesn't line up with the soundtrack. It doesn't line up with the bands that he would go see at his local bar. It has nothing to do with the aesthetic of the movie, but it does line up with how Hollywood depicts rock music whenever someone actually plugs in a guitar.
Yeah.
Which always sucks.
Even in like Nightbreed, like when the girl's singing her song, it's just trash. And you know what it reminds me of? It reminds me like if Joe Satriani heard Nine Inch Nails and was like, oh, this shit's hot, and then tried to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think the other problem I had upon rewatching this movie is how bad the acting is. Like, no one is really giving a good performance.
Except
Ernie Hudson.
Ernie Hudson is in another movie in this film. He is like totally slaying.
He's making up for Ghostbusters.
Totally.
Yeah. And the character he plays is a combination of two characters from the comic book. So there's a beat cop that the Crow runs into right after he's killed the dude from Gideon's pawn shop. And there's a homicide detective who destroys Eric Draven's file so that no one will know who is doing these murders. Because the comic book is really, as I remember it, being 90s John Wick. I mean, there's no moment where you don't think the Crow is going to get vengeance. He is just a killing machine coming through the whole thing. And I think it's better. Like, they talk about how the movie, like, some people who are like Hollywood apologists talk about how the movie needs to have these things in it to be successful to an audience.
Right.
Which is fucking bullshit, because John Wick doesn't have any of that stuff. He's just murders, and that movie murders.
Well, I wonder about that, because one thing that I really questioned in this movie, and it's even more so in the comic book, is in terms of the rules of engagement as they exist in this world. What do we think of superheroes that are totally impervious without relying on the rules of screenwriting as they're dictated to us and how acclimated we might be to them? What do we think of justice that's doled out in a story where there's no tension?
Yeah.
So in The Crow, it's about following how he's going to mete out justice, but at no point is there a question whether he's going to succeed. So there are bullets flying and people getting knifed to death and losing limbs, but we don't ever question whether or not the protagonist is going to see this through to the end. Absolutely. And in a sense, all Hollywood movies, that's pretty much what we know. Like, there's action movies don't leave us hanging with business that is unfinished, but some movies like The Crow, I feel like you feel it. Like with John Wick, obviously John Wick's gonna get his man, but you see the obstacles as they come. But with The Crow, there are zero obstacles. There's only his angst. And that's not good enough. That's not really much of an imposition on his ability to murder every person in his path.
Well, what I would probably say to that is that The Crow in the movie is a superhero. The Crow in the comic book is a supernatural spirit of vengeance.
Right.
And so in some ways, he's like Michael Myers for these thugs.
Yeah.
And there's not any stopping him. And I love that about it. And we were talking about, I think via text, that I think this is like basically, the comic is basically like a black metal album. It's kind of one note. It's very severe. It's very harsh. It's overly emotional. And it's black and white, obviously. And I think that is to its advantage. What's different about the newer version that came out in 2017 that James O'Barr he added some stuff to, And when I read that,
The newer version of the comic book.
the newer version of the comic
Yep.
book, for a moment I was like, man, is this like George Lucas style where he ruined Star Wars because he was like, oh, I don't have this. But what he added were these intermissions of their life together before the murder. And I think it adds quite a bit to the comic book. I think the 2017 version is the version to read because it does kind of counterbalance like the straight vengeance. But I mean, but in the movie, like I know what you're saying, like, you know, you sort of almost need that like, oh, is it going to happen? But you know in your mind that the oh, is it going to happen is a lie. So why not just dispense with it and go right into it?
Maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of exactly what I'm wondering.
Yeah.
Going back to the quality of acting, I wonder about Brandon Lee because we didn't really get to see him do anything in his life. He had a couple of bit parts and then he did this. And to be fair, all of our favorite actors have done terrible movies in which they were terrible.
I mean, Keanu Reeves, perfect example. Before he hits John Wick, he is in a ton of shitty movies.
Yeah, but I don't think of him as a great actor. I guess I'm thinking of actors that most people would agree are super fucking skilled. You can always find pieces in their CV where they were making choices that didn't land. Actors who are really amazing at their form often are the types of people, you know, someone like Nicolas Cage, who's
That's
super,
exactly what I
super
was thinking.
confusing. But the one thing you can say is when he's amazing, it's because his choices work. When he's horrible, he's just making choices that somehow don't line up. And it's embarrassing. And I wonder if Brandon Lee might have been actually an incredible actor who was in this piece where he was making these excessively laborious, hard to sit through choices, and it just kind of didn't work the way none of this movie did. But if he had another director and just sort of got more time to watch dailies and realize that he should be doing it a different way, approaching the material a different way, he might have been amazing in this movie.
Yeah,
maybe.
when you go back into, like, so a lot of people are going to be totally bummed at that point of view. Like, a lot of people just love him in this movie.
Yeah.
Like, that was the thing. And we've had a few posts on Instagram, like, about that we're doing this episode. And the response has been pretty surprising to me. Like, I thought no one would give a shit about this movie.
Right.
Or I mean, I knew people loved it at the time, but I thought people might have just, like, packed it away as a thing from their childhood or something.
Yeah.
People love it. And, you know, this movie was really cursed in a lot of ways. There's the legend of the curse, like the Bruce Lee curse, but there's also the fact that this movie had some really shitty ideas going into it. Like, for example, there was one moment where the idea of it being Michael Jackson as the Crow and the movie being a musical was on the table, which is crazy town. I mean, I kind of would really love to see that now.
Yeah,
and the part of me that loves R. Kelly's Trapped in the Closet wants to see that,
yes.
you know? But, you know, if you're James O'Barr and you've made this heart-wrenching piece of art, when somebody says something like that to you, what the fuck? And so he refers to it as like, you know, you have this tree that you've planted and you've grown and it's beautiful and somebody buys it from you. And every single person who had money involved goes and pisses on it a little bit. And, I just feel for him, you know? And apparently the director, Alex Proyas, and Brandon Lee were the forces that brought this back to as good as it is. So everything bad about it, some people like to say it was just the studio fucking with this movie. And they moved the production to a non-union city. Apparently cocaine use was rampant on the set, which makes a whole lot of sense.
Yep.
And like, so I do think Brandon Lee is really stiff, but what's interesting about him is all of his attempts are to replicate what happened in the comic. Like, all his dialogue is basically from the comic, but it's a little off. You almost wish he'd have done his own thing in the role instead of trying to be the comic book character. Who knows?
I can see that.
You know, I don't know.
Yeah.
And then Alex Proyas, he's directed a few other movies. Like Dark City looks very much like this movie and is very cool. The screenwriter of this movie, David Shaw and John Shirley in particular, did Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3, which is the least good of the originals, and the reboot prequel, which is horrible. And because this movie made a shitload of money, everybody went on to work afterwards.
Yeah.
So there was just like a mix of no talent and earnestness and just greed mixed in with this movie. And you just wonder if like an auteur director had taken it on with somebody who's really great. Like Johnny Depp was mentioned in the early part. Like, imagine Tim Burton, Johnny Depp's Crow. We would probably be like buying t-shirts of that. Well, you do buy t-shirts of this at Hot Topic, but like, it's hard to know. Would it have been more successful? This movie had so much impact.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. The little girl is terrible.
I agree. She was miscast.
Yeah.
She kind of doesn't work for what the role is. And then her acting, she just doesn't have the chops.
And then her voiceover work is bad too. And since it narrates the film, it's not great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think this is also interesting in that it's an example of MTV aesthetics making their way into Hollywood.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of Hollywood directors cut their teeth on making music videos.
Yeah.
But Hollywood did not wholly embrace MTV's aesthetics too quickly. It took a while for what we take for granted now with fast cutting, with cutting rapidly against music, popular music, rock music. That wasn't really a thing. Like Tarantino, for example, hadn't left his mark the way we all take for granted the kind of juxtapositions between action and music and editing. And this movie was an early example of that. And that might have been why it was so revered at the time compared to how it's aged.
Yeah.
Because at the time it was pretty revolutionary to have moody music and just long, languorous shots of Brandon Lee's torso twisting in agony in the shadows of a loft.
Yeah.
That sort of shit was MTV's staple.
Yeah.
But Hollywood, not at all.
And then the gunfight scene set to Thrill Kill Cult. At the time, I would have probably said it was my favorite action sequence ever. I mean, just because it was just so cool for its time. And our partner, Dirk Fontenot from Comic Book Club and Labyrinth Lifers, he was saying, hey, you guys got to talk about like music video soundtracks. And while MTV didn't make an impact on, I think, the way the movies looked, movies certainly wanted to use MTV as a way to promote movies. And there were all these videos that would have like clips from the movie that was upcoming in them. And I mean, it goes back pretty far. Like Cyndi Lauper had that Goonies video where there's like scenes from it. And then, of course, Queen's Highlander soundtrack.
I don't remember that.
Oh, have you not seen Highlander?
Yeah.
Okay, but so Queen, the album is "It's a Kind of Magic," which is one of my favorite albums of all time for some reason. But but the Highlander theme song, which I can't even remember the actual name of the song, it's just Highlander theme song in my brain. It had clips from the movie, and then there was like a bunch of them. But this movie had that. There was a video associated with it, and it was to get you excited about the movie before it came out. Yeah, but I guess you don't see any music videos anymore. So
no, there's still an MTV Music Awards for some reason though. For what we all watch on YouTube at this point.
Weird.
Yeah. I feel like there was something our intern posted about this on the Scary Thoughts Instagram page, and there was a lot of dialogue about the soundtrack in particular.
Hold on a second. I think we've abandoned the intern thing a while back in an episode.
We did.
Okay. The lie of the intern.
I'm keeping all of this in.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, you're the intern.
Yeah.
What were people saying? What was the exchange about the soundtrack on Instagram?
Well, people loved it. And there's like kind of a moment. Well, for example, Omar from Pop Scene, he just did a night on Saturday night that was basically like 90 soundtracks. And so there's this awareness brewing of the time period being the time of the hot soundtrack. So you had The Crow, you had Trainspotting, the Dumb and Dumber soundtrack was beloved for whatever reason. And people had this soundtrack. I mean, the number of times I had sex to this soundtrack on was uncountable.
Ew.
Yeah, it was fucking great.
Music soundtracks with pop or rock or whatever has an interesting history because, again, it's something we take for granted now. And pretty much any movie has some hit from the 70s, 80s, or 90s slammed into a very key part. That's just it's a trope of so much Hollywood cinema now. At some point, you're going to hear REO Speedwagon. It's just what fucking happens.
The James Gunnification of the guy that did Guardians of the Galaxy.
Oh,
yeah. I mean, he didn't kick it off, but he's dialed it up.
But he really, really milked it. But back then, thinking of the Massive Attack, Most Def track on the Blade 2 soundtrack is one of my favorite songs. And it was just, it happened because of that soundtrack. And the Judgment Night soundtrack, which I don't know if anybody listening has even ever heard of the movie, but that soundtrack is collaborations between all of the sort of like alt metal, not new metal, like sort
Sonic Youth.
Well, that's true. That's not metal, but I was thinking more like Helmet.
Body Count.
Yeah.
Yeah.
With like Booyah Tribe and Ice-T, and it's this really fascinating soundtrack that never could have happened without Hollywood money being behind it.
I remember when I adore that soundtrack. I think it's really good.
It's brilliant.
And I remember thinking like, oh my God, this is the direction of music. Like I thought at the time that music was going to be like that. It was going to be this blending of genres, but it took this hard left turn into nu metal.
Yep.
And it was terrible. Nu metal, I mean, I think it's all terrible. I have no fond memories of anything from that. So Deftones, I
Tool.
probably wouldn't count. I'm not a fan of Tool. Korn is terrible.
Yep.
But now you see a lot of genre mixing. Like, you see Post Malone, for example, is a good example.
Of what?
He's a rapper, but he'll do like a Metallica song live or something like that. Run the Jewels has kind of like punk metal beats sometimes in some of their stuff. So it seems to be like the Judgment Night sound is sort of emerging a little bit now.
Right.
But I wonder if anybody like producing music references that soundtrack now.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I just have the note, revenge doled out as poetry.
What does that mean?
I don't know. I think that pretty much sums this up, though.
Well, there's a lot of poetry in the comic book.
Yeah.
I mean,
but I think of it like the comic book is not an action comic. It's poetry where people are dying.
Yeah, there's a lot of like very artsy fartsy stuff in the comic, that I think really sort of tuned my taste a lot. Like there's like modern dancing going on in the comic book. Like there's these scenes where he's like going through these weird, like almost, Suspiria remake, bare room dancing around ballet shit. I mean, it's bizarre.
Well, that is one thing that is in the comic that's also in the movie that I appreciate that they do in different ways, is that the comic book, as you were saying, like introduced you to, you were talking even more about this off mic, but introduced you to Joy Division and Rimbaud and all of these poets and writers and musicians and bands. And then the movie itself sort of does that as well by having this really amazing soundtrack that got one of the best non-album Cure songs ever written and got Trent Reznor to cover a Joy Division song. Like, it's pretty important what stemmed off of both of these things to introduce the kids to a larger circle of influences.
Yeah, I mean, anyone who's listened to this show for more than one episode knows how much I love Henry Rollins. I'm pretty sure this is where I heard of him.
Oh, yeah.
Either this or Beavis and Butthead, the Liar video, like one of the two. Either way, it was like, it wasn't Black Flag that introduced me to him. It was this like later pop culture stuff that led me to him, that led me to Black Flag.
Although that is interesting that it's not the first time I've heard someone refer to something they love was because they saw it on Beavis and Butthead.
Well, Rob Zombie, dude. The first time I ever saw White Zombie was Thundercat 65 on Beavis and Butthead, and I had the same reaction Butthead did. I was like, yes.
Well, I mean, that was the cool thing about Beavis and Butthead is I didn't think it was very funny, but it was MTV where they would actually play fucking anything.
Well, think
so you
about
got
it.
exposed to fucking anything. And that was way more interesting than seeing, I don't know, Britney Spears again and again and again and again.
Yeah. Well, think about it this way, too. Like those Beavis and Butthead episodes are kind of like the earliest reaction videos. And think about how popular reaction videos are now, where you watch some dude that lives in the ghetto of Chicago hearing Queen for the first time. And I fucking love those videos because I love seeing like the pure reaction to something. Now people are like kind of faking their reaction, so the reaction video is kind of over now.
So you're like a purist. You like the early shit.
I liked the early shit because one of the things it showed to me was that like great art is undeniable, you know? And so when you hear, you know, Queen's Under Pressure, it doesn't matter who you are. That song jams. Yeah.
So maybe let's talk about the conspiracy, the curse.
Sure.
I wonder if everybody listening to this knows what it is and it doesn't need to be said, or if nobody knows, or anyway.
Yeah. Anyway, I mean, you want to...
No, you go.
Okay. So
you probably read more.
So, I mean, there's a bunch of different takes on it. I don't find any of them very convincing. So Bruce Lee was said to have had like a curse on his family. Like his younger brother died or something like that. And when he was a baby, they dressed him up as a girl and called him by a different name. He was born in the year of the dragon, in the hour of the dragon. So he had this very auspicious birth, which combined with the previous sibling's death, the family was very superstitious about his upbringing. And so he came to America. He had been born in America, so he had American citizenship. And so there's this idea that the family had some sort of like darkness over it. And then he comes to America, opens his martial arts school in Oakland, which is pretty cool. Brandon Lee was born in Oakland in 1965, so living in Oakland now, I feel some pride for that. He is the first kung fu teacher to teach non-Chinese people the arts. And apparently there was like this like Chinese triad sort of thing going on in Chinatown, and they were like not having it. And he's like talking shit about traditional martial arts in the way that the conversation around it now is like you see MMA people beating the fuck out of Wing Chun dudes on the regular on YouTube. I mean, it's just because it's just not practical.
It's one of my favorite things to do.
It's great. You know, and Bruce Lee, through his Jeet Kune Do, was really like, depending on how you count it, the godfather of MMA. He was one of the very first public figures. He wasn't the only person doing it. Like Judo Gene LaBelle was really good at mixing martial arts. And actually Chuck Norris was pretty legit. Even though, I mean, of course he's legit, right?
No Steven Seagal, but...
No Steven Seagal, but... so he's teaching non-Westerners Kung Fu, and so there's this idea that he was like, you know, family curse, maybe Chinese mafia curse, like all this stuff mixed up together. There's a legend that is portrayed in the movie Dragon that he fights some champion of the traditional Chinese martial arts and wins, and he wins his ability to teach, and after that his school blows up. But there's this whole thing about how he was cursed. And then he died under mysterious circumstances. The most recent biography that is like good about him. So I didn't know this, but he had his sweat glands removed from under his armpits so he wouldn't stain up his shirts on film because he didn't like the way that looked. And then he had a brain aneurysm at like 33 or like an edema or something like that. And so some people think that because the day he was filming was so hot and the removal of the sweat glands overwhelmed his body and he died from that. But a lot of people were like, how did this totally healthy stud of a man just drop dead at 33? Obviously, an ancient Chinese curse.
Of course.
Right. And then the movie Dragon, the Bruce Lee story, portrays this literal demon after him through the whole movie. But there's a scene where the demon turns and goes to the infant Brandon Lee. And so some people think that that movie foreshadowed the eventual death of Brandon Lee. And the way Brandon Lee died is there was a prop gun on the set that had been fired in a previous scene, and the cap from the blank was lodged in the barrel of the gun. And then they put another different type of shot for there's different types of loads used for like when you're doing action movie scenes. Some of them just shoot a little bit of fire out. Some of them are they're basically like guns. So if you put a blank, like a movie blank to your head and pull the trigger, you would be killed. But this different type of blank had a lower powder load, which was for close-up shooting. It shot the previously fired blank wad into Brandon Lee, and it went into a blood pack that had already exploded, and he hit the ground And because nobody really knew what was going on, he basically bled out on the scene. He didn't die on the scene. They tried to give him blood transfusions, but he dies. I don't find the curse very convincing. All that said.
No.
Yeah. I mean, I think he dies because there was a lot of corners being cut on the film, incompetence on the set, cocaine on the set.
Well, there's an extension to this curse, which is that the movie itself was cursed. Because
Right.
if you look at, it's sort of similar to what we were talking about with the poltergeist curse. There's a laundry list of shitty things that happened on the set of this movie. People getting injured, things getting destroyed, etc. And then, of course, death. But reading about how much cocaine was being consumed on the set of this film, maybe standard Hollywood coke use, but it sounds like everybody was high. And you would have to think that if everybody on a film set is high out of their minds and not getting sleep, and like eventually tons of shit is going to go wrong. And someone getting killed is not completely out of the realm of possibility.
Yeah. Also, amazingly enough, like this late in Hollywood, 94, the rules around firearms handling there weren't as strong standard operating procedures on set. This death basically has made it safer for everyone else in Hollywood, which is I guess the only bright thing to come out of it. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, in some ways you're like, man, it's amazing this movie even looks as good as it did, or it even came out at all.
Yeah, because so much of it had to be done with CGI.
Yeah, although less than you'd imagine. There's only a couple scenes. Like some people are like, "Oh, this movie, the things that are wrong with it was because Brandon Lee died." Not really. I mean,
Not really.
The only scene that really had to have CGI was when he falls off the roof. They put his face onto a body double, and then there's scene when he puts on the makeup. There's some chicanery.
Well, I didn't see anybody speaking to this, but there is also the factor that when you make a movie, it isn't always you shoot the script and then you're done.
Right.
It's often, you see dailies and you do rough edits and you look at them and question, what does this need? What is unfinished? And if your main actor is dead, that's not even a consideration. So it is possible that this movie could have been considerably better, not because there were scenes that couldn't be shot with him, but because there was there was far less ability to solve problems that were observable about it.
Where would you put this movie in relation to horror or nihilism?
Well, it's kind of like I was saying about movies like Donnie Darko and Angel Heart and The Hunger and Ginger Snaps and Cat People, or May. They're like kind of horror movies, but they're kind of not. They're more just like really fucking gothy cinema, and there's death. But so I don't know. I mean, it's not a horror movie and it's not a musical. It's kind of one of those movies.
Yeah. I think the comic book is way more nihilistic.
Totally.
And one of the big differences is the way Eric Draven and Shelley are killed in the comic book. It's a random act of violence. And to me, that is more horrifying than the goofy, like, Tenants Wright murder that happens in the movie. Like, the character Top Dollar is just one of a bunch of dudes who participates in this act. But in the movie, he's elevated to the position of, like, the big bad. And I think that character, even though Michael Wincott, the actor, who I for years now have thought was Jeremy Irons for some reason. I remembered it as Jeremy Irons. He's having a lot of fun in the role.
Yeah.
And he's actually delivering a pretty good performance underneath that awful wig. But his sister girlfriend is terrible. Yeah. Just totally stupid.
She got a lot of work in the 80s.
I guess. I'm not familiar with the actress other than this role. I mean, I understand why they made that like big bad character like that. I just think tying it to like greed and giving it that, it's a lot. You can understand it more than the random act of violence. And the random act of violence is scarier to me.
Yeah. So Eric Draven and his girlfriend were evicted and they said, fuck you, and they stayed. So they got murdered but nobody even cleared the caution do not cross police tape from their door a year later.
Yeah.
So why is this gang clearing out and burning down houses in Detroit?
Yeah, they're not throwing up condos. It's like,
right. Unless there's like, this is like a long game.
I guess. I mean, they certainly haven't done any work in Detroit since then.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just bad. It's just not done very well. I mean, there's no explaining it.
What else?
The final fight scene is very Beauty and the Beast. Like it's on top of a Gothic cathedral, and he uses a piece of the church to fight.
Is it raining?
It does. It's raining through the whole movie, but it can't rain all the time, can it? Hey.
Wah, wah.
Okay, as somebody who was slightly older when this movie came out, like, did you just saw it and that was it, or
Yeah.
Yeah,
Never thought about it again.
yeah. I mean, when this movie came out, Halloween came out right after. It might have even come out like I can't remember if it came out in September or October, but there was definitely like enough time to get costumes together. There was like a murder of crows out that year, man. I mean, there were so many. And I've dressed up as the crow, even just like at my house, like trying it out to see what it would look like. And I remember just having the crow costume on and being like, man, I look fucking cool. And I went out and I saw somebody else who had like a slightly better costume. I was like, fuck. Like, I suck.
Oh,
It was devastating.
Did you electrical tape your hand?
I did.
Nice.
Yeah, I did. I went more with the comic book look.
Yeah.
And I had like dyed black hair at the time and shit. I looked totally
When people
stupid.
said, "Oh, you're the crow," I love Brandon Lee. You're like, "I'm from the comic book."
No, I don't think anybody would even said shit to me, to be honest. Yeah. I remember there was like a comic book convention in New Orleans, and like there were like 10 crows at it. It was depressing because you're sitting in your house in your little womb of a room, and Michelle T writes about this really well in one of her books about how like you create this like total environment for yourself, and it's like this little magical space. In that space, you're having this emotional bond with this comic book, and Gothicness is not a team sport. So you go out into the world and you see all these other people who've had the exact same experience you've had, right. And it just completely destroys the specialness of it.
That hurts.
Yeah, it does.
Something this made me think of too is the cities in America that have a Gothicness to them. Mm-hmm. Like we can definitely think of San Francisco having some sort of dark core. Mm-hmm. We definitely think that about LA. We definitely think that about Detroit. New Orleans probably invented it. New York will always have the Gotham City-ness to it. Philadelphia has that. I just sort of love that so many of America's cities have an association to a sort of dark undercurrent that runs through its history, a sort of mystique.
Yeah, you almost imagine that people in Europe just laugh. Like if you're in Prague, you're like, with your Gothicness. All those cities are just featured prominently in a gang of vampire novels and ghost novels and witch stories and whatnot. I think that you have to have like a serious underclass in a city to attain that level of Gothicness. And this is something else I was thinking about, is that being a goth is kind of a lower class phenomenon. To me, like cool people, happy people, people who had money were not dressed up as goths in Louisiana, for sure. Like you might have had some like West Coast Robert Downey Jr. less than zero dark wave shit going on out here, but in the South, post Satanic Panic, it was not the thing to do until it was the thing to do.
Right.
And it was mostly poor people.
Huh, I don't know.
Yeah, so I've always associated it with like a little bit of an outsider artist phenomenon.
No, I have no idea. Can't think of it.
What was it like being goth in California?
I don't know. I don't think I'm a good example of it.
Because you're Canadian?
Well, I used to go to this goth club in the East Bay called Primary, obviously, after the Cure song. And there were goth kids kind of sprinkled all through the East Bay, but it's not like I was connected to what was happening in San Francisco and definitely not connected to what had been happening in Los Angeles. Like Los Angeles death rock scene is fucking legit. You know, as far as what's goth like in California, how do you wear all that black lace in 105 degree heat is not something that we had to grapple with the same way in Northern California.
Yeah. If you wanted to be goth in Louisiana in the summer, you had to be committed.
Right. And smell terrible.
Yeah, dude, I had these like 10-hole Doc Marten boots that just smelled fucking awful.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just the disgusting wet leather smell. Ugh.
Oh, my God.
Gross. So I think one of the cool things that James O'Barr has done is he kind of created a new type of supernatural creature. And I think that's pretty cool. I mean, there's like 4 movies. There was a TV show right after the first movie, several novelizations. One of them was done by Poppy Z. Bright, which is, you know, clearly a paycheck novel. It's not very good at all. You know, he like knocked it out of the park with this story, you know, and I think that there's something to art from trauma that allows that to happen.
Yeah. I'm a little conflicted with that because something that is such a staple of stories, cinema, is that your protagonist, who is always a man, is spurred to action by the death of a woman. Mm-hmm. So a woman needs to be violated and or erased in order for there to be any sort of velocity to a man's self-realization. And that is such a tired staple and definitely something to me tiresome about this story. Like, yep, dead woman, man goes on a rampage. Man can't be man without a bunch of men killing his woman. But this story was based in a real death.
Right.
And that he wrote this story to sort of like exercise his pain and his anger around the loss of the woman he loved. And then there's another layer, but he claims that this did not do that for him. That as far as him like exercising his demons and trying to work through his pain by creating the crow about his losing the love of his life, it actually did not do that in any way.
Yeah.
It might have made it worse for him. So I think this is all like really fascinating and complicated.
Yeah.
The way that art has the potential to help us work through things, and then sometimes it actually completely fails.
Yeah. I think there is at least one female version of the crow.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, I cannot remember. I mean, I should have looked this up before, and I'm definitely not going to bother now.
Well, the fact that we don't remember it might say something.
I mean, it's probably just not very good.
Yeah,
you know, like,
yeah.
and this is something that happens in comic books, and it's one of the critiques of like gender swapping characters. If the only reason to have gender swapped the character is to simply present a female version of the character, and that's the primary reason, while those you might have had noble intent for doing it, it's not. If the story doesn't justify it in some way, it's like, for example, like how many women would go on a revenge spree killing after their husband was killed in real life? Like, it's probably not nearly as high as the number of men who would at least say that they wanted to do the same thing.
Should I ask Monique to come in this room and see what?
I mean, like,
if I was murdered, what she would do about it?
Yeah, I mean, it'd be interesting.
Hang on a second.
All right. We should ask her cold.
Oh, yeah.
Say.
Yeah. Monique? Are you busy? Damn it. When you're done, come visit. She's actually taking a bath at the moment, and unfortunately, none of these mic cables aren't long enough for me to go stick a mic in her face while she's bathing. Maybe we'll get her to come out and answer this question.
Yeah, I mean, and then, you know, obviously some women are ride or die, you know, like I just watched a video of this young woman shooting a car from her car on an Instagram video. Like, she's like the fucking gang member. So like, and like I watch enough, I don't know, women are as vengeful for sure, but like gunfights, maybe not. I don't know. You know what? That's fucking stupid. Like, people just feel how they feel and then go to war when they want to, one way or the other. I think the times have changed for sure. It's like, once you get your hands on a pistol, you can do whatever you want to, I guess.
That's America.
Yeah.
Oh, Monique, come here for a second. We have a question for you.
Yes.
Okay, Monique. Thanks for joining us.
Hello.
Okay. If you and Mark were broken down on the side of the road and Mark was murdered by a gang of thugs and you had the ability to avenge his murder through violence, would you?
I might.
You might.
I mean, the ability to, and then like what would be the consequences?
You don't have to think that far. Just like you have the ability to murder 5 people brutally.
Yeah, I probably would.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you think that would be an experience that would be broadly female? Like, do you think most women would?
I don't know. I mean, this isn't like a hypothetical that we're presented with very often. So this is an interesting hypothetical.
And that's kind of the not presented often, I think, is probably at the heart of like where we were tripping up on it. Because we're talking about how in movies it's frequently a thing where a lady will be killed, a dude will go on a rampage, and it's a thing. Totally. But at the same time, most guys would probably say, of course I'm going to fucking do that.
Right.
But you don't see the opposite where like a woman goes on a rampage in revenge very often, or I can't think of too many strong examples.
I mean, it's usually she gets raped and then goes on a rampage, or she gets raped and then her partner goes on a rampage, or she gets killed and then the dog she gave him gets killed and then he goes on a 3-movie rampage.
Yeah, which is the best 3 movies ever made. It's interesting. Like, I wonder if, like all things, male, female, just simply presenting with the women with the opportunity to think about vengeance, they probably would.
Yes.
Yes,
and I mean, the political climate actually has gotten me thinking about that a lot. Like, there are a lot of situations that have come up, and not just this year. I mean, over the past, many years, but occasionally I think like, God, I'm saying this on a podcast, but sometimes it's just like, okay, that makes me want to bring back the guillotine, or that makes me want to go on a fucking rampage, or like if I had nothing to live for and I wanted to strap a bomb to myself, and just take a bunch of people out. Like, I've had those thoughts for sure over the past couple of years.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think that we all have exes. We know that there's vengeance in the female heart. So it's probably maybe I kind of expected you to say yes, so yeah, I was pleased.
Good. I mean, I'm not I guess, I mean, I don't know, I don't feel like I'm a particularly vengeful person, but that's a particularly, that's like an egregious, horrible, horrifying situation you've presented, right?
Right.
I think it's pretty human to feel that level of vengeance for that level of...
Yeah. Yet another vote for vengeance.
A vote for vengeance.
Thank you for vengeing me, Monique.
I will hypothetically vengeance you always.
What were we even talking about? I completely lost track of what we were talking about.
Revenge.
Yeah, so...
Sprees.
Yeah, I mean, it is a trope that the man is driven into action by the death of a woman, except in the case of John Wick, where it's the death of a dog, which is actually kind of like...
But his wife has already died. So it's true, like, killed his fucking dog. Like, it's this refrain, and it's often very funny, because it is funny. It's about a dog.
Yeah.
But he is aggrieved because his wife is dead.
For sure.
It's already there. It's like we didn't even have to confront that.
Yeah, but...
She's erased before the opening credits
she doesn't
roll.
even get a chance to be in the film. But in the context of John Wick, I was thinking about like John Wick and The Crow and what they had together in common. There's a scene where like John Wick digs up all of his artifacts of his John Wick life.
Yeah.
And it's very much like a from the grave moment. He like digs he digs the idea of himself out of the ground and becomes himself again and goes for it.
That movie is so fucking smart.
Yeah.
It just really is.
Yeah, the whole thing is great.
I'm going to watch it again tonight.
I'm going to watch it tonight too. Yeah, could you imagine Keanu Reeves is the Crow now. It would just be John Wick with makeup. It would be Juggalo John Wick. Well, I was thinking about an example. A counter example would be that woman, the police officer that shot the dude in Texas, I believe. Like, she walked into the wrong floor. She was off work. She was texting somebody. She walked into an apartment that she thought was hers, and she shot a man.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, like when she was being sentenced, that man's brother like forgave her. Like, you know, he had this really impassioned speech about how he had forgiven her and he didn't want her to have a bad life because he knew his brother wouldn't want her to have a bad life. There's something really powerful about that act too.
Yeah.
But it is not available to me, man. I am all about like Old Testament vengeance.
Yeah, I believe deeply in forgiveness, but I don't even know that I value that level of forgiveness.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely value it. To me, like, I had such an emotional reaction to it that I thought it was an undeniable like act of something. You know, there's definitely something to it. But then it conflicts with my idea that I don't, for example, despite all of my like bloodthirstiness or whatever, mostly performative, I'm not a supporter of state-sponsored execution. I'm not.
Yeah,
I don't like the state meting out justice like that. I think in the heat of the moment, if you can catch somebody slipping and put a 45 in their face, fucking awesome. But I don't like it from the state or something. Like, is there something too Inquisition about it or something?
Totally.
Yeah.
What do you think about just the vengeance in general? Just the superhero-dom is predicated on this, right? The going outside the bounds of civilization to mete out justice. I mean,
yeah. I mean, it's one of the things that I've always like not really gotten about Batman is like you just forever vengeful. Like, you got to stop everybody, or is it like localized, like more of a, is it more personal?
Well, that gets into something like Luke Cage, where you're just trying to fix your neighborhood.
Well, in that point, like, a character like Luke Cage, like a superhero is about the common good. Whereas like, that's where it gets slippery with like the Punisher is a character of vengeance. He's not a character about the common good. He is about vengeance.
Vengeance, not justice.
Vengeance, not justice. Yeah, it's a different thing. Even today, people's minds, like vengeance and justice, get mixed up a little bit, like the way they think about like broad things in culture. I think vengeance should be personal, not political. Like, you should go kill someone that has done you wrong for a very serious thing, not so much like this class.
So no Hatfields and McCoys?
Well, that's more like a blood feud. That's kind of a different thing.
Well, but it's a blood feud, but at the same time, the newest generation has active anger at someone who just like, you've got to take revenge on the most recent iteration of how the blood feud is playing out.
Yeah, and then this weird, you see like almost cosplay blood feuds where it's like Dodgers versus Yankees or that sort of thing. Like, people like have these like faux blood feuds associated with sports. Like, I went and saw my first Raiders game ever, and it did not disappoint. And right in front of me, there was two families sitting next to each other, and it was Raiders were playing the Chiefs. The Chiefs' colors are red. The Raiders were, of course, black and silver. They're the coolest looking team, even though they're not the best team. This kid was wearing a Supreme shirt, and it's red. And he's sitting on the Oakland side. And this drunk dude is like trying to fight this like 16-year-old kid over the color of his T-shirt. And he's a fucking Raiders fan, the kid's wearing a Raiders hat. And these two families like start fighting in front of us, and the cops had to come down and pull it apart. And like, it's like, is there an urge to the blood feud maybe? Like in human DNA or something like that? I don't know. But that game was great. The Kansas City Chiefs, their quarterback is phenomenal. He rained down on Oakland, which was kind of a bummer. But when we left into the parking lot, an RV had been like cooking meth or something like that. There's basically a favela around the Oakland Stadium of homeless RVs, and it burst into flames, and the sky was just full of black smoke during this football game. It was kind of awesome.
Wow.
Yeah, it is a nihilist football team.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Speaking of Supreme, the clothing label just had like a party across the street at the sister bar to the bar I work at. And there were like hundreds of kids like drinking in the street, and cops came and they started throwing firecrackers at the cops. Someone went and threw an M80 into the cop car. The riot brigade came, and these skaters were like throwing bottles and M80s at like the riot cops. And
That's crazy, man.
it was nuts.
Yeah. And the police in Louisiana have a different way of dealing with that sort of thing.
Yeah, I'd imagine if that happened in Oakland, there would have been gunfire. But San Francisco cops seem to be a little mellower.
Yeah, I don't know, man. I never see Oakland cops, period. So I don't know. They just don't seem to be in my neighborhood.
Yeah. Be nice people.
Yeah. Unless your wife is killed by characters in a comic book, then you have to become a spirit of vengeance.
Absolutely. So what have we learned?
We have learned that if possible, raise yourself from the dead and enact your vengeance.
Do us all a favor.
Yes. Do not let your employees do cocaine on set. Otherwise, someone might die.
Yep.
90s soundtracks were probably the best.
Maybe
not. Yeah. Well, speaking of soundtracks, now it's more like there's like the auteur soundtrack thing, right? Like, so like the dude that did Mandy, that guy was great. Tom York did the Suspiria soundtrack. Trent Reznor did Girl with Dragon Tattoo. Like, that seems to be more of a direction it's going in.
Which I appreciate, because I think that what it is coming to replace is these musicians who have a broad palette are replacing the, what's that, John Williams or Barry, what's his name? I don't know. I really hate symphonic soundtracks, or scores rather. And I'm so thankful that people like Tom York and the late Johansson are part of this movement, and even, Stranger Things with Survive, that there's a lot more sort of broad composition going on into cinema soundtracks.
Yeah, there was supposed to be a reboot of The Crow with Jason Momoa, but it fell apart. And I was wondering who you almost wanted to have like some sort of like cool electronic score.
Oh yeah.
I mean, I think Trent Reznor would be a perfect pick
for
it, especially with the connection to the previous movie.
Oh, that's true, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's all I've learned.
Great. All right, so once again, don't forget to join our mailing list, scarythoughts.org, and we will see you next time to discuss Eat, Pray, Love on our second episode of Self-Help for Nihilists.
We're going to keep it dark, so don't be afraid.
It's a promise to you. Thanks for listening.
Sorry, I totally fucked this whole thing up.